Good afternoon, Year 12s. Welcome to the second video in this series, where we're going to be studying and exploring the poem The Ship of Ice, which is by far the lengthiest poem within Dobson's collection that you will study. This is the poem that gained her fame within the literary world. She won the Sydney Morning Herald Prize for Poetry in 1948 for this poem, and it is what we would refer to as an epic poem, as it is a poem that tells a very clear story and is obviously of a very extended length. It tells the story, a very true story, of a boat that departed from the port of Lima in Peru and was never seen nor heard of again. However, it was discovered many years later, stuck within a circle of ice, and all the inhabitants on board had obviously passed away and had in fact been frozen in time, which we know is a clear consideration for Dobson in her poems. Because this poem is so very long, we're going to look at it in sections. So we're going to look at it in sections per slide, and we'll be analysing it as we go and then doing a holistic overview at the end. Alright, so just as we did for The Fisherman and the Moon, I'm going to read the poem, but this time I'm going to read it in sections. I will highlight as we go keywords and imagery that I think are important, and you're going to consider along the way why you think I might have highlighted these particular words. You are going to be discussing some of the recurring imagery, themes, language, etc. that comes up within this poem, but I also want you to think beyond my commentary as well and ask yourself what questions are raised within this poem and what connections can you see between The Fisherman and the Moon, but also as well other concerns that fit within her poetry that you've recognised within the timeline and the conceptual ideas that I've outlined in the previous document. The English schooner Jenny, which left Callao, the port of Lima, in 1823, was locked in an ice barrier of the Antarctic Circle for 37 years. On the 22nd of September 1860, the ice barrier opened in front of the whaler Hope, revealing the frozen ship. Captain Brighton of the Hope went aboard the Jenny and found the bodies of the skipper, his wife, and the crew in a perfect state of preservation. Time is a thief. At the end of a road is a river. Time is a dream. A life is contained in a moment. Well, have it your own way. For me, a world in a moment once, brief understanding, in lazy summer while the blue fly buzzed at the window, and a single raindrop gathered, rounded, and fell. But the miracle passes simply, amazement is wordless. Discovery silent, stumbling suddenly into the truth like a landless sea. While the raindrop falls and the afternoon gilds and lengthens and everything becomes a trying to remember. Okay, so immediately we can see some clear correlations between this poem and The Fisherman and the Moon. We have a clear concern and preoccupation with the concept of time, and in particular this idea of seizing or freezing time. So in the previous poem, she talked about stalactites and this idea of the dripping of water and the movement of water and the fact that we freeze water. In this time, again, we have ice, a very literal freezing of water, where something that moves and rocks and sways with rhythm and with repetition and that really cannot be stopped has in fact frozen and has been stopped in time. Interestingly, here she has used that concept to look at humanity as well. So we know that Dobson is very, very preoccupied with this idea that time is a very eroding force, and there's nothing much that we can do to stay the effects of time. Yet here she demonstrates her preoccupation with the fact that ice can preserve life, it can preserve time. Now, these people that are aboard the Jenny are very, very much dead, but they have been preserved, and she emphasises this as a perfect state of preservation. which is a very interesting turn of phrase, because then this is juxtaposed with this concept that time is a thief, that it's something that steals from us, something that we wish to retain. In this way, we see a very youthful Dobson who perhaps is unsure about the effects of death and or life, and she doesn't fully understand them yet, perhaps. So this idea of stopping the effects and the marching of time is something that could be seen as very youthful. And she emphasises this in her brief understanding. She recognises her own innocence and the fact that she doesn't fully understand what life is all about yet. We're going to have a look in a moment at the imagery that she utilises in the opening couple of stanzas of this poem. She talks about the fact that time is a dream and that it is just a fraction, a glimpse of a moment, okay? That it is something that cannot last and will not last. Here we see crossovers with ideas that we explored in Close Range, in Brokeback Mountain and Manny Prull's stories. This idea that humans are incredibly ephemeral. We are not here forever, and that life and the human experience of life is brief, and that it is just a glimpse of time, and it is something that will continue to unfold with or without us. So here we see this idea that a raindrop continues to fall, that a miracle passes, that discovery is silent, and that truth will reveal no matter what. The raindrop will fall, truth will come out, and the afternoon will grow longer and will eventually fade. So everything comes back to this idea of, again, trying to grasp something that is eluding us. This was the story of a ship caught in a bottle, and that bottle was time. I confused with another image, becalmed in time and sealed with a cork of ice, frozen and still. In the bottle, ice on the rigging, over the masts and yards, the drops suspended, frozen for 40 years. No water lapping, no wind to persuade the stiffened sails to drive them, and drive them whither in a bottle of glass and ice. Quiet on the decks, so wordless that one would say this is a vessel of drowned men. Over the side, lost to a watery lure. Who knows what magic, beckoning up through the clear, green, shifting water. A city under the sea, a drifting mirage. As if one circled, lost and alone in the desert, and who can imagine the horror of deserts of ice? Or else one might say this was a ship of disaster. Think of the bodies, splintered and broken, the cabin with blood on the walls dried now to a faint inscription. The thundering fist to the jaw, the lamp set swinging, the glasses tumbled, wine dripping over the table. All of them killed, you say. What a tale of fury. But the truth of it is that this is a ship of living, locked in a wall of ice, suspended in time. And listen, if we could stand on the deck with them, we might hear voices. Here we see again this idea of stopping time, stopping something that is naturally moving, and instead freezing it and preserving what's within. So we see imagery of ice, of sealed, of becalmed, of frozen. We see this repetition even of stiffened sails. These ideas of things that should move, that no longer do, is quite an interesting and intriguing concept that she presents to us. And here again we even see a contrast later within this stanza of the contrast between the movement that should be there, this idea of fury, smashing things, breaking tables, life, or at least the struggle to retain life, is then contrasted with absolute frozen, locked in nature of death. and this idea that it is in fact suspended, that life no longer exists. We also are introduced to one of the concepts that Dobson deals with throughout many of her poems, this idea that once something is captured in a moment, whether that is a painting or a frozen ship or a poem, do we retain that essence of life? Is that thing lasting forever? Will it be alive forever? Or is it only an imitation of life? Is it only an imitation of living? And that's something we have to ask ourselves, and in fact something that Dobson deals with quite often. Is artwork actually freezing a moment in time, or is it a perspective of something, and something that is not truly living, but just a replica of something, an imitation of something that no longer exists? First voice. Standing here, lad, with a bucket of frozen water. I forget what I hold it for, and so forgetting try 40 years back to remember. Remember anything other than cold that cuts through my thinking, freezing the flow of memory, damming it short. Of warmth and fire and light, the lamp in the cabin swung from its chain at the crossbeams, shifting, golden. Moved. I could move once. I turned of a sudden with the bucket, and somebody nailed me, still in a shirt of ice. It would crack now. Look! If I bent my arm where I hold it, swung back a bit to balance the weight in the other. I've tried off and on for 40 years. Boy, did you say so? 40 years. No wonder I can't remember. A fire, a candle, a lantern, well, only dimly, swinging away on its pewter chain in the cabin while we rocked on the waves in the wind, each motion nearer. And the seamless shirt of ice, that is not the end in death, and not a beginning, but a waiting torture with memory, a half-forgetting. You there? Can you hear me? Can you hear what I'm thinking before I go back into silence? Second voice. Somebody's knocked at my ears with a kind of hammer. Yes, 40 years, that's what I said. I heard the captain. Fascinatingly, Dobson chooses to adopt the voices of the 7 inhabitants of the ship, and she tells the same story from 7 different perspectives, which is really cool to listen to. When we hear the first voice, we get this kind of incredulous wonder at the fact that he has been trapped in what he calls a shirt of ice for 40 years. But what I find most interesting about this is, again, the contrast between frozen and movement, but also this idea of half forgetting, that he's trying desperately to hold on to something that is elusive. Again, we're seeing a pattern between things. For him, it's a memory of his life that's once gone. For Dobson, it could be something rather different. First voice. He's talking. Second voice. He was. Just now I heard him. I'm a-sitting here trying to count. I'll be getting on to 60 and Captain near 90. No wonder his beard's all whitened, standing there looking upwards, surprised, in the hatchway. First voice. That's Snow where his beard's all white, and you're not 60. No, lad, you're 20. Back where it all began, from this timeless damnation on ice. If I'd turned my head, I could see you. I could only see the boatswain leaning there by the rigging, where he clutched the backstays to hold him. Hey, boatswain, better come some hemp to hang you than hanging in time forgotten by death or by living. Third voice. I hear you sometimes. It comes in waves like. That's if you can remember. A wave that heaved and a good ship plunging forwards, wind in the sails and a great bird winging slowly, the sun on the afterdeck, the deck in the forecastle, and the warmth in the cabin coming down after the dog watch. Though the feel of the warmth, that's what I can't remember. That's what you said, eh, did you? By God, you look strange, man, there, standing there with the bucket. So here again we have repetition of trying to count, looking upwards at something that we're not quite sure what he's looking for. Perhaps he himself is not even sure what he's looking for. And this idea of not being able to remember. So again, we get a repetition of something that is eluding them and something that is just beyond their perception. We also see this idea of timelessness, that despite the fact that they've been trapped there for 40 years, nothing has changed. That this is one of the few things that can arrest time. But it's superficial. Yes, he only looks 20, although perhaps 60 covered in snow, but he's dead. He's earned nothing for that ability to stop time. First voice. A statue, I suppose, shaped out of ice for memory. For those who can't remember and can't forget. I wish I was set as a statue here for forgetting. Hey, Captain, Bosun, you, Tom, there, were you in the boat, crouched with your head in your arms, not at an angle for sleeping? No, they're not listening. One after another will drop back into silence. Silence, and sometimes afterwards speech again. Which is the worst aloneness? Who would be wise? Listen. There is being alone that we all must come to. Death, the almost naked journey, departure, arrival, however you choose to view it. There is being alone in a crowd, a chosen withdrawal, singling a part of the mind, also in action. A man alone with a lathe and a plane whilst the shavings noiselessly fall to the ground, or one who whistles all day behind his plough with a word to no one. While the brown earth opens in darker waves behind him, or a fisherman mending his nets by the edge of the sea, and in creation a man alone with his paints, a flicker of brushes in a web spun out of silence. Or a woman sitting with hands folded over her womb. And some are lovely, when the lover leaves and the flames goes out of living. But worst of all is for 7, alone, together, neither with past nor future, but walled in ice, with sometimes thoughts between us shaped like words, but soundless. Here we must ask ourselves, what feelings or emotions is the first voice feeling here? How would you characterize his particular reflections on life? Would you suggest that they are hopeless? Would you suggest that they are melancholy? Would you suggest that he is saying that being alone together is far worse completely? What do you think he is reflecting upon here in this particular stanza? Interestingly, I want to draw your attention to this. In creation, a man alone with his paints, a flicker of brushes, and spun out of silence. Is art a consolation for being alone? Is that a possibility? Questions, but no possible answers just yet. Second voice, voiceless and still. And which is the worst of the ways of dying? We know it a crucifixion in time that lasts forever. Can we say we are dead or alive who are now half dying, midway between the two in a desolate ocean, nailed to our crosses of shivering hammers of cold? While the blue sky mocks overhead for the one who stares upwards, and at night the bedeviling stars on each of the rest of us sees but a plank or some rigging, or a pail of frozen water held in the hand. But imagine, supposing another ship should reach us, that men of another time should hail and warm us with the fire of life, the flames of movement and laughter, clambering over the sides with faces astounded, running over the decks with hands towards us, amazement, wonder. Second voice, supposing. Third voice, think of it. We begin to see more of Dobson's reflections upon the impact of death, and especially the unknown of dying. Dobson doesn't know, and Dobson is a little bit fascinated by this, and this concept of what happens between people who are frozen in time. What happens between life and death? Is there anything that happens, or are we caught forever in this moment? Does it become a state of purgatory? Interestingly, we also see this concept of past and present overlapping. The fact that artwork, poetry, language, painting, whatever it might be, does have the ability to capture a moment in history, which can then be explored and enjoyed by people years and years later. And she raises this here by this ship being discovered by men of another time. First voice. No, lads, don't listen to me. They'll find us dead if they stumbled this instant on us. And what would bring them southward to charter these frozen, desperate, lonely seas? We belong to death. Fourth voice. I suppose if you kill what you hate, you kill yourself. Something in that, maybe. God stiffened the skipper, that's what I said, and whatever stiffened the skipper stiffened us bloody all. I should have knifed him. Days before we swung in this desperate distance, ages before when we first left harbour at Lima, I should have smelt the stench of death when we boarded, seen Hal's crossbones hanging from the masts and rigging, since the devil himself is the old man here in the hatchway. I should have known the eyes in the hollow sockets, the evil that glinted sometimes behind his silence. I should have remembered the bony hand that signed me for a spell at the end of the world. Hate was between us, from the first day out of Lima. And hate for me was something to fuel and cherish. While he fed my fury with cunning, handed me firing to heap my guilt, then clapped me in irons on a pretext and came again to mock me at my smouldering flame, and still our sails were set for the end of the world. Well, I broke away, thrust through the hold and found him here in the hatchway, clenched my fist and cursed him, and something stiffened us all. This is my death, to stand before him forever, mouthing the words of fire with fist upraised and the breath frozen in utterance. Maybe the wind which turns to stone when it changes. Maybe the wind changed then. No, not the wind, but the power within me for hatred. No, nor God, but the strength of my lust to murder stiffened the skipper. The others, God rot them, I care not. Not for myself condemned to an age of dying, for here where I stand I can watch him suffer his death. The fourth voice here appears to be a much more angry voice. But I also want you to think as well, what other word would you use to describe the tone of this particular piece? He says that he cursed the boat, that he sensed danger and death when he stepped on board, and that he sought out the skipper to ask why he'd been arrested, and he cursed him, and then the boat froze, and he says, you know what? My curse now is to look upon him forever. The man I really disliked, I have to look upon him forever. So there's a lot of questions raised about the fourth voice that we don't know the answers to yet. But I definitely want you to think about the tone. I want you to think about this repetition of the word of hate, but also in particular this idea that hate, despite its negative connotations, is something that can fuel and fire us. That passion should not be overlooked in whatever form. Fifth voice, the captain's wife. A bride on a ship? You might say, how pretty. A trouble of skirts on a tilting deck, hands clasped in a touching delight of wonder. An albatross, really? A whale? That speck? Something to cosset, to charm and to honour, wind flirting curls and a worry of spray, a ripple of laughter and ribbons and laces to comfort with strength and to shield from dismay. I remember the branch broken away from the plum tree, the white foam running like light along the bow, and the deep sea booming voice, the sudden panic of question and answer, my mind gone wandering, dreaming, on the flower of the branch the promise of spring in the orchard. Surely I must have been dreaming, so soon to be married to the deep sea voice, to the husband of oak and brine. Then the journey down to the ship, the foreign faces and the torn farewells, a flailing flutter of hands that seemed to be petals drifting down in the orchard, day after day. Wave upon wave, I sat below in the cabin and behaved in a manner befitting the wife of captain. The captain, my husband, firstly the captain. I suppose I expected too much warmth and affection, a certain sensation of being longed for. A feeling of being at one and at home, though ship was our shelter, with wind-whipped deck and a reeling cabin of cold, white as a bride of ice in a ship set southward. white with the sterile whiteness of frost, not petals, with promise of summer, children to laugh in the orchard, the warmth of love that would seed the fruit of the womb. This is a very different voice to the angry fourth voice that we just encountered. This is indeed a female voice, the solo female voice upon this ship, and it's very different from the outset. We have very clear and very obvious poetic conventions that are not existent in the previous stanzas. We have an element of rhyme here, we have alliteration in the failing flutter of hands, and we have assonance here and repetition in this concept of white, white, white. And here she presents a very, very standard and traditional feminine voice in this idea that it is one to decorate and to care for and to be something to adorn a ship, but not something to be particularly useful. But she captures within it also a sense of lost hope. We get a sense that she entered into this marriage with a sense of optimism, with a hope for affection and warmth, as she points out here, and especially for a sense of being longed for, something that she wishes her husband would show her, but he is actually not upon this voyage. And she says that she set out into this marriage and on this voyage with the promise of summer. Now, this is probably not a literal summer, but a metaphorical summer. A summer of hope and happiness, something that never ever comes to fruition because they do not get past this voyage into the ice. So she says she set out onto this voyage with a hope for a future, but this hope is very quickly diminished. There was a story of another wife who looked back to the home of her childhood, not with the strength in the present or the faith of an unknown future, and was turned to a pillar of salt. I also am turned to a pillar of ice that is salt with tears. Lot's wife, captain's wife, she to a burning city, and I to the past with a heavy heart and longing. Though the sin was unwitting, a weakness, a hope for comfort, a stretching of hands for familiar things and for love. This is a very brief biblical reference here. When she references Lot's wife, she's talking about a story within the Bible where Lot's wife was instructed not to look back at her previous life. She disobeyed and was indeed turned into a pillar of salt. So here we have a question about female subservience, but also as well, should a female be satisfied with life married and the lot that she has been given in life? We get a sense of yearning, which we also got in The Fisherman and the Moon, perhaps for something in the past or something yet unknown. Sixth voice, the captain. Now, I thought, and I shaded my eyes to the distance, now, if ever, O sweet, after life's endeavour, over the rim, at the edges of the world it rises, the promised land, that warm and temperate valley, ark of a drowning world to shelter the chosen. Cradle for kings coming after, the seed of my loins, my golden pastures ringed in a desert of ice. I was the Lord's anointed, mission most secret. I was that righteous man who was plucked beforehand from the burning cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, I alone finding grace in the eyes of the Lord. And I took a wife, which I held to be right, but would never lie with her till I reached my fruitful kingdom, that all should come to pass as it had been foretold. We boarded the ship at Lima. I signed a crew, good and bad, a matter of little moment, so long as we headed southward. South, south to my promised land, and always it rose like the psalm within me, that it found no voice. The better, since I must keep to myself the knowledge, and southwards I said, though I saw that the men were surly, wisdom spake in me, some I rebuked and punished, and she I had taken to wife below in the cabin wondered and feared till our eyes were dark with dismay. Another day, I thought, but a watch, but an hour. Then I climbed from below to the hatchway, lifted my eyes for the glow at the end of the world, Elysian region, and I was still to attend to the voice of the Lord, his finger directing my sight to the Holy Land. I waited. And, O God, thine appointed was struck to the heap of ice. I had not sinned. Wherefore this visitation? I would turn my sightless eye to the sky and question, wherefore bind up in chains thine own anointed? Appear to me, Lord, in a pillar of flame and answer, but speak to thy chosen servant, and he shall hear. It's a very different voice to his wife, and of course to all of his crew that have come beforehand. We get a sense of a very pious man here, someone who's very religious and relies upon the word of the Bible to guide him in his endeavours. Indeed, he references the story his wife referenced beforehand, Sodom and Gomorrah, but instead here he talks about his pathway as a man, whereas she talked about her pathway as a wife, pertaining to that same story. He talks very much about his mission and this idea that he must continue no matter what. He must continue in no matter what kind of adversity he faces. Interestingly as well, though, we don't know exactly where he's headed. It's again an elusive and vague destiny. Is it a true destiny that he's heading for? Is it something that he is striving to attain that he cannot grasp? What is it that he is actually searching for here? Spring might have released them if spring had ventured unwisely so far southwards. Imagine, in a strange season, disenchanted from an age-long spell of ice, shaken, wakened to movement, shifting, swirling, blue-green the water with drifting flowers of snow, green as garlands of leaves swept southwards, and a ship that was rigged with frost and ice, awaking, shaking the drops from the mast, the frost from the canvas, while seven, alive, stretch, arms rub eyes of amazement, and the years run off their shoulders in showers of rain. 40 years, 50 years, remember coloured boy, Thomas, cabin boy, waiting at table, washing in the galley, remember earth pots and yellow corn cobs, the hot sun at midday midway over the village. 40 years, 50 years, remember small boy, travelling to the coast by riverbed and mule trail in the season of springtime, down to the ports and harbours of a new life. Lima and the ships setting sail for foreign places. Again we get a crossover between past and present time. So she's talking about the impossible here, that 60 years later, 50 years later, whatever it might have been, that somehow these people can be awakened. Now this of course is an impossibility, but what could she be talking about metaphorically here? Is this about reawakening from a past time? Possibly. Is it about perhaps delving into and exploring a glimpse in time that's been frozen in artwork, in words, within an image? What do we learn by looking at the past? Storm might have released them, or if a storm could split such ice with a mace of lightning, pluck a frozen ship like a saint from prison and set it sailing home. Picture the waves bursting and cracking, tossing the ship like a rack of driftwood, one to another, water topping the starboard rail like a river. Or imagine darkness towering over a cauldron of hell, while the crew awake to life in the hour of danger, voices torn by the wind in a wild amazement, haul the halyards taut and snug her down. Leaving Lima on a night of thunder, fighting your way through the port to the ship, remember, sailor, the coffee-coloured dancer between the beaded curtains, hand on hip, the clutch at the throat when the lights were guttered, the thunder and the darkness, the devil and all to pay. What shall we do with the drunken sailor? Sow him in the scuppers and we'll get him away. Why, longshore sailor, did you ship away? For foreign lands or for better pay? Here we get a little bit of a reflection about the motivations of these sailors. Dobson begins to question why they left Lima. Were they fleeing from something? Were they fleeing from their own guilt? Had they indeed engaged in some kind of relationship or lust for a native of Peru and a dancer in some way? Were they escaping their own sin? What was going on, and why, indeed, did they leave? Was it for better pay, or was it for something else? And we're not quite sure what has motivated the sailors to enter onto this ship, and whether they are actually getting damnation for their sins and they're actually getting what they deserve, or whether this is just the thoughts that pass through our minds when we are about to die. Seventh voice. In London town there lived a gal, her shape was trim, her name was Sal. Spent my money on Sally Brown, but you played her false in every port, with ladies of the lighter sort. Seventh voice. Why, scarce had I looked out to see that my true love was false to me, so I up and hauled her colours down. Sleep might have rescued them. Imagine a statue of ice in a pose of action, and sleep descending softly in drifts of snow, warm, warm and dark like a mantle melting, the harsh constriction of ice that kept the boatswain clutching upward of 40 years to the backstays. Oh, sleep, come sooner or later. Pretend to be death, the road to nothing and nowhere, end without end, and give these 7 uneasy souls their peace. Dream on, old fellow, clutching the rigging. Sleep, boatswain, your uneasy sleep. There was a field of flax, remember, that waved the wind's way. Boatswain, sleep. There was a field of flax and sunshine. The mower came with a scythe to reap. The cold, keen blade, and sooner or later, dream you awaken, death will reap. Again, we get a little bit of information into the motivations for, or the guilt that the sailor may be feeling on this ship. The seventh voice definitely talks about cheating on someone that he loves, and the fact that he pledged faithfulness to a girl called Sally Brown, but as soon as he went to sea, that faithfulness disappeared. But then we start to see a slightly different look at death towards the end of this particular group of stanzas, suggesting that no matter what guilt they may have felt in their life, no matter what anger, no matter what fear, that everyone finally deserves some kind of peace, and that death and peace comes for us all. It's inevitable, and that death in fact will reap. And there's an imagery here of the Grim Reaper, so the image of death in the black cloak with the giant sword, and talking about reaping life like death. What did you seek as you felt for the rigging? Chance of life, or dispatch to grave? Who would think of a third way? Surely, hemp to hang you, or hemps to save. Finally, death released them. Death in the guise of discovery. But playing at skittles at the end of the alley with life, forgot his errand for 40 years. Then remembered the names and addresses, which was vague, being only a bottle of time and ice in the southern regions. So spied out a whaler sailing in the Antarctic, and second Jonah himself entered into the whale. Up in the crow's nest the lookout thunders the sighting, stabs with finger over the troubled waters, at a vaporous spouting of air headed from leeward, which was death in the gorge of the whale. Driven Leviathan outstrips their chase in a blubbery worry of foam. South, south to the mountains of ice he draws them. Mountains of ice, deserts, grinding, cracking rivers of ice, lakes of it, slipping, falling, white. White as nothing but ice, tumbling into the green and broken water, all under a sky of brightness and swords. Death in the whale dives down, and the barrier over. We get again a look at this duality between life and death. Hemp is obviously a fabric often used in ropes, and saying that hemp is either to end your life or to save you, that you fashion a noose out of hemp, or you use rope to save yourself from being washed overboard. And finally, she starts to look at this idea that death marked them 40 years ago, but then forgot about them. And now, using this whaler who's going to break through the ice and discover them, is finally going to let them be at peace, to actually die. They've been caught between life and death for 40 years, and he's actually going to let them be at peace. And here we see again the breaking free of their purgatory. If we look closely at all of the language here, it's absolutely filled with movement, and why that might be. What is that symbolising? swings apart at the end of the world, revealing a time-locked frozen sea. A frozen sea like glass and a ship upon it, fashioned of frost and ice, mere cobwebs at distance, and the whalers hold their breath, astonished like children, at a ship which almost it seems could be held in the hand, at a crew fixed like stars in appointed places, death, now in a world that gives no other entombment than a winding sheet of ice and a drift of snow. Boat hooks clinch with the main chains, the men swarm upwards hand over hand, topping the icy bulwarks, and shatter the bottle of time. Shout out at amazement, exclaim at tragedy, reckoning the death and disaster, computing the years and the waveless tides of time that washed the decks in silence. That was the story. Question the manner of telling, but be sure at least of ice and pain and silence. Of time, well, there one can never be certain. For you a thing to be measured, perhaps. For me, a searching. And for 7 alone on a frozen ship, I wonder. However it was, is beyond our chance of knowing. You'll be spending some more time looking at the conclusion of this particular poem in class, as it appears to capture, in essence, the direction of a lot of Dobson's future poetry. But we're definitely going to be looking very quickly here at this idea of shattering a moment that was once frozen in time and unlocking the potential of the past and what we can gain from the particular past. But most importantly, we're going to look at this final stanza. The fact that there is no certainty in storytelling, there's no certainty in art, but there is certainty in time. The fact that time will continue, that ice, pain, silence, life is going to continue, and it's something that we cannot arrest no matter how hard we try. And the fact that what fascinates us is the searching and our chance of knowing.